All right, next up, this is a great segue into Will Little. As the COO at Plandec, he's bringing some data that might surprise you. Those studies promising 20 to 55% of productivity gains from AI coding assistance, while there's more recent research behind that number. Developers feel faster, they're actually taking longer. So Will is going to explain why and walk us through the RACER framework for turning AI tool rollouts into real business results. So please give a warm welcome to Will. Will, thank you so much.
Hello. That works. That's good. That's a good start. Thank you, everyone, for having me today and sitting in on the talk. I gave a sort of precursor to this talk last year, and it seemed to resonate quite strongly with the crowd, and I think a lot has changed over the last 12 months, certainly, which made a lot of sense for us to do a bit of a checkpoint. Now, as mentioned, I'm the COO of Plandec. I joined the business about 8 years ago, about a year prior to COVID, and so I've had the privilege of being able to watch a huge transformational journey, not just in terms of how teams are working within the engineering space, but more importantly, how we think about metrics, how we think about how we measure our productivity, our throughput, and with AI now, that's accelerating the need and the demand more than ever to do so. We talk a lot about the gold rush of '49 when thinking about the recent wave of AI adoption. There's lots of claims, there's lots of excitement, research left and right that's making, a lot of these being driven by people selling AI, by the way, but making huge claims. But we ourselves have seen, in fact, a lot of these stats, which we ran sort of mid last year, are completely antiquated. We ran a workshop yesterday, and just in that workshop alone, about 50% of the people there had already had about 90% adoption in their organization, with the far majority of them using AI in a sort of pairing mode or an assistant mode, as opposed to moving more towards agentic. But we are seeing movement in that space. What's interesting, though, is with all of these claims, there aren't a lot of organizations that are actually seeing material benefit realized in terms of how we deliver software to our customers. And a big reason is because we think about AI and the adoption of AI at an engineering level, and there's huge individual productivity gains, particularly around code generation, test generation, and so on and so forth. But the reality is far more complex. There's a big study that was run last year by MIT that found that 20% of the engineers in this study had claimed that AI was making them 20% faster. But when you actually took a step back and looked at the SDLC, those teams, in fact, were delivering 20% slower. And the reason is something we really want to focus on today. And I'm going to walk through a bit about productivity, how to think about it, how to measure it, and then overlay the RACER framework, which is an approach to how do we drive sort of a more AI-augmented engineering organization and the steps that you can take as a technology leader. But the real focus for us is going to be on constraints theory. When you start to think about the SDLC as a system, and you start to think using theory of constraints, the individual gains that we see from code generation, test generation, are often being absorbed by those system-level constraints that have already been there. AI doesn't fix a team, it exposes some of the challenges that have always been there. Good teams recognize this and are thinking proactively about constraints and limiting them. Other organizations that are struggling are really focused, in fact, focusing too much on AI adoption use cases at the engineering level and not taking a step back to think about the actual system of itself and how we identify and eliminate constraints within the SDLC and the PDLC. So what we'll cover today is I'm going to walk you through a productivity lens. How do we think about productivity in software engineering, and how do we start to link that around engineering focus? I'll walk you through, quite briefly, the RACER framework, and with a particular focus on the constraints. And then I'll leave you with a couple of thoughts around things that you can put into action this week or next week when you return to each one of your organizations. Now, I'm going to start with this model here, which is quite a crude way of thinking about it, but I think it's an important way of thinking about it, because we, as engineering folks, always tend to overcomplicate and overthink everything that we do. And actually, when you distill it back to the most fundamental basics, when we understand the investment in an engineering function within our businesses, what is success? What does value actually mean? And it's not about trying to figure out the revenue per epic or something arbitrary like that. The reality is it comes down to something very simple, which is understanding for what we invest in our product and our engineering functions, what do we get out of that in terms of new business growth? Are we delivering what matters, and are we doing so in a way that's much more efficient? So translating that into a concept of engineering, we talked a little bit about this last year, but I wanted to bring it back because I think it's a really helpful way of starting to think about that utilization and productivity. Every engineering function starts with 100% capacity. And how we ultimately get to the point where we understand what we're going to be spending our time on that's going to drive actual value for our business and for our customers is ultimately going to be a result of some essential planned capacity work. So if you work in banking, you know that 20 to 30% of your capacity, you're just going to take it off the shelf straight away because you know you have to focus on compliance and regulatory work. What you do with that remaining bit is ultimately going to be a function of the things that you didn't realize you had to do, surprises that come along the way, or an underestimation of quality issues, and the efficiencies of which you deliver. And that's going to leave you with the actual capacity that you have to focus on roadmap. So when we think about how do we drive productivity, from our perspective, we think about how do we optimize this model such that we can maximize the amount of time that our engineering teams have to focus on the things that matter. And AI has great potential in this space, particularly when you focus it on technical debt, focus it on backlogs. It can be very liberating from a capacity perspective for engineers. We've updated our 4 pillars of productivity this year, and I think for engineering leaders, this is a helpful way to start to think about and structure how do you measure what matters. We're often compared to car manufacturing, but we don't have the luxury of being able to count cars at the end of the week or the end of a month or the end of the quarter. Software engineering is a lot more opaque. And so we start to think about what does it actually matter? How do we define and measure productivity within engineering? For us, it comes down to these 4 areas. Number 1, very simply put, at the end of the day, how much time did we have? Were we able to focus on things that are going to move the business forward? New revenue growth, digging a deeper moat around our existing customer revenue, as well as driving better customer satisfaction. Speed, which is your traditional sort of flow metrics. Do we, as a process, are we able to identify and eliminate friction points and inefficiencies in that process so that we can deliver as efficiently and quickly as possible with the resources that we have? Predictability to me is massively important, especially from a reputational perspective. Being able to do what you say you're going to do on a continual basis is an important function to have within your DNA as an software organization. And quality. And this isn't just building good quality products. Obviously, we're all here to build good quality products. But there's an important value exchange that we make as team leads, engineering managers, engineering leaders, when we think about quality. If we're able to have the luxury of being able to respond to, let's say, a bug immediately when it's found, it's going to take a trivial amount of time for a developer to fix that. The context is fresh in their mind, code base is still the same, you can make that change, you can go quickly. With AI, it makes it even more simple. However, if we decide to over-prioritize new features, things that drive typically incentives with most teams, ultimately those bugs go into the backlog. The longer they stay in the backlog, when they do finally come to a developer, it's going to take that developer a significant amount more time between context changes, code base changes to resolve those issues. And that ultimately is time that's being lost from the thing that matters most to your business and to your teams, which is making your customers happier. So when we think about AI role and the theories and constraints, AI is very effective at accelerating coding and testing activities, okay? But they do expose bottlenecks. And I'm sure many of you are seeing these on a day-to-day basis amongst your teams, whether it's with code review or requirement gaps or deployment functions, okay? We need to think about the AI adoption not as a tool adoption program, but as a transformational change, one that considers not just your engineering practices and your processes, but also looks at the operating model which you run, and most importantly, the culture that you're building around AI and around your engineers. Ultimately, system speed is limited by your biggest bottleneck, okay? So at any point in time, doesn't matter where you are in the journey of AI adoption, that speed at which those teams are going to be delivered are going to be slowed down by all the same constraints that existed and have existed for possibly years, whether they're technical, process, capacity, whatever those constraints are. So we developed this model to help technology leaders do 2 things. One, how do I start to structure and think about this change program? How do I measure it in meaningful ways? And how can I communicate that both to my teams, but also to my board, my excos, other senior executives that are very curious as to when is our 10x productivity going to show up? We bought some licenses. Where is it? GitHub says that we should have huge 20% increases from day one. So the first part is around rollout. And this is very basic, very simple, right? CFOs are putting a lot of pressure on understanding where those productivity gains are. The reality for most technology leaders is they understand the cultural challenges in adopting these tools. And so it's really simply a matter of understanding of the license we bought, how many people are using them, how frequently are they using them, what are the patterns that we see around whether it's token usage or suggestion acceptances, and most importantly, around trust. How do our developers feel about this journey, whether it's productivity, constraints, confidence in the tools, confidence in different LLMs, and so on and so forth. Being able to track and manage and measure that is really, really super important. The second part is around the approach, okay? Now, there is no single best approach that we would recommend or suggest. It really comes down to the type of task and the type of team that you have and being able to identify the right patterns for the right task itself, okay? There are 4 models that we typically tend to look at or we tend to see across our customer base. One is very much the sort of traditional asking model. So this is, asking Claude to generate slides for a presentation. It could be asking for ChatGPT to provide some sort of information on a script or whatever it might be. You've got the assist mode, which from our research at the moment, about 50 to 60% of all teams are within the assist mode, okay? You've got the agent supervised mode, right? So these aren't autonomous agents. These are, a human orchestrating multiple agents in the context of typically feature development, technical debt. That's where we see a much, much bigger population of teams moving today. I would say 3 months ago, it was about 20% of the respondents of the survey were in this mode. And even yesterday, when we did the session here, about 45% of folks that were in that room yesterday are running agents in supervised mode. What's interesting, though, is very few people are actually running agents in an autonomous mode. And whether that's having listeners to issues that are coming through from production and being able to review that, check the code that was recently made, and be able to open up PRs for a human to review. So these are not fully autonomous agents in the sense that there's no human involved in the feedback loop. There definitely are. But with some of our clients, we are starting to see that model start to appear. And it's changing. I think that the key areas where it's being utilized is with well-defined tasks, but it's also forcing them to think about and rethink how they actually structure and organize their teams. So there's a couple points here, I guess, just I won't spend a load of time on this before we can get to the constraint side, but thinking about your value-driven processes, looking at things like your story of refinement, having AI readiness checklists, and having clear success criteria going into the way that you're able to actually use autonomous agent. Thinking about your technical foundations is really, really important. And this will come through a little bit in the constraint side, but this is one of the areas that pops up with most organizations around what's holding them back, what's constraining them at the moment. Whether it's internal knowledge, knowledge bases for AI references, code-based complexity mapping, and more important these days is around security testing and observability guardrails. So what are we inputting into the AI agents in order to provide the right sort of policies and guardrails so that they can be most effective in a semi-autonomous or fully autonomous way so that there are no surprises coming back during the feedback loop. And testing it is really, really important, right? So we've seen a number of different approaches with our customers. We had one recently who actually had done a 4-month accessibility transformation in their front-end application. Then once that was done, they had the COE team that was running, I can't remember if it was Cursor or Devon, one of the two, take a shot at redoing it. And it took them end-to-end 1 week to get what was semi-production ready, and then a couple of tweaks over the next week, so it took them 2 weeks instead of 4 months. So using some of your existing projects today and being able to then remodel them using a COE with some of these agent models is a really interesting way of doing it. Now, the constraints is where I kind of want to focus a little bit more of our time today, okay? So, again, a variety of different research out there. I don't put a ton of credence into it, but from what we've seen, anyone's reported somewhere between 20 to 55% of acceleration when it comes to AI code generation. But the code review process has been increasing significantly. Deployment processes are becoming overwhelmed, and testing infrastructure can't keep up. So the bottlenecks are simply moving downstream. What was before a human bottleneck or a capacity bottleneck is now becoming very much focused on a process and automation bottleneck. So the result is individual productivity, the things that are actually benefiting the organization today, are becoming muted because of these system-level constraints. So how do we start to think about this? What's the practical steps for you to take? So we've got a 4-step model that we work with our clients on today, and really it starts with the identification. And there are 2 important sources of identification of constraints model. Okay? One is your quantitative data. So taking a look at the data that you have today, connecting across all of the different tool chains, whether it's your workflow tools, your build pipeline tools, your repos, your deployment tools, your service monitoring tools, pulling all that together to actually be able to do a system-level quantitative approach and exactly where the bottlenecks are in the organization, and being able to then identify those and backlog them. We'll get that in a second. The other part, which is really important, is the qualitative. Okay? So being able to have active surveys that are running on a regular basis with developers to highlight where there are specific issues that they're facing when it comes to the tools that they're using or how they're working, the processes they're working, and what they're getting from this. The next thing we'd recommend is to categorize them. So the clients that are doing this very effectively have a very clear structure of the categorization of where their constraints exist, whether that's tooling or code base and architecture or workflow, documentation, training, culture, governance around that. Being able to actually identify, capture them in a Jira or an ADO or a linear, whatever you're using, and treat them like a backlog. The really, really successful teams go into every iteration, whether they're a Kanban team or a Scrum team, it doesn't really matter. The way that they act is very similar in the sense that they process 2 backlogs at the same time. They have a constraints backlog that they're continuously managing down, as well as the traditional backlog of whatever that they're working on, technical debt, new features, bugs, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? They visualize it, and it's very important to visualize it, whether it's a dashboard in a tool like PlanDeck or something more basic like a Power BI. It is important what gets measured, gets managed, visualize it, talk about it, include it in the organizational stand-up, and also include it in your senior conversations, whether it's Scrums or your Xcode, whatever there might be. And then focusing on the ones with the highest impact. So when you do actually categorize, making sure that you're actually prioritizing each one of those in terms of the scale and the impact, and starting with the ones that are having the biggest impact on the SDLC today. And then socializing it with stakeholders. I think this is really important because the expectation is you buy a license and you achieve results. And it's not that simple. There's a human element to the adoption, and then there's a constraint element in terms of the system level thinking. So being able to socialize this with key stakeholders allows you to control that conversation and help other folks understand exactly where the challenges are that's holding the teams back today. And then repeating it, right? So including that as part of your continuous improvement cycle, evaluating the metrics repeatedly, pivoting when needed, and ultimately just obsessing over this. Again, the teams that are succeeding the most with this are the ones that really embed this within a day-to-day, week-to-week process. I won't go through too much of this today. Obviously, we'll share these slides afterwards, but this just goes through and helps define a little bit what some of those categories are. The teams that succeed are the ones that measure baseline constraints before adoption. Okay? Now, many of you are well advanced into the adoption phase right now, so some of that might be difficult to retrospectively implement. But what I would be doing today after this is going back to the teams and thinking about, right, how do we start to identify constraints? How do we backlog them? How do we categorize them? How do we talk about them? And how do we measure against that? That will also then drive the ability for teams to become better at anticipating where new bottlenecks are going to emerge. If we resolve this, what's going to be the consequence of that? Okay? Proactively investing in those areas, so spending time. I think that the deployment pipeline, testing automation are the kind of clear, obvious cases, but actively investing in the areas that you know are going to be the biggest constraints as you are able to accelerate speed and velocity in which the teams are able to work. Proactively, and then see individual gains translate through to the team and the organizational outcomes. Teams that struggle are really only focused on AI adoption. They're surprised when the metrics don't matter. They see individual gains absorbed by individual efficiencies, and they blame the tools rather than addressing the constraints themselves. And you probably recognize a few of those coming up in your organizations today. The next one is around how do we evaluate, how do we measure impact in real terms, okay? And so using this model, like the 4 pillars, allows you to be able to ultimately see to what extent as we move through the speed, the quality, the predictability, are we able to optimize the amount of time that we have to focus on things that are going to move the needle for our business? also becomes a much easier talking point as to why you're doing this. If you go in with traditional flow metrics or DORA metrics, stakeholders tend to struggle to understand the so what of this. But when you actually translate that into terms of value and how teams are working and how that links back to whether it's specific business goals or just overarching, how are we helping to optimize things that we're focused on that are going to help move the needle in the business, a really important talking point. Tracking against industry benchmarks. Understanding where you sit, where your strengths, where your weaknesses is really important. We've launched the new 2026 benchmarks. I've included a QR code if anybody wants to download them, but essentially that will give you a very good way of being able to understand not just where you are in your journey, but how does that compare to other organizations? Where are your strengths? Where are your weaknesses? Most clients are very surprised at what they find. And then lastly is the ROI formula. And I won't spend a load of time on this today other than to mention kind of a couple points. So it's really about a combination of revenue acceleration as well as cost avoidance. And what you'll need to do is sit down with the finance teams and agree what those measures are going to be for your business. Start to implement them today and track. And most importantly, make sure to include the total cost of the tooling. Because in addressing constraints, you're going to introduce new costs, whether it's automation costs or pipeline costs, whatever it might be, that needs to be considered as part of the overall formula in terms of the total ROI that you're able to generate within the business. So to wrap up this bit here, when thinking about it, it is a systems problem, not a tool problem, okay? The measurement of all of this is fundamental in terms of highlighting constraints and also being able to resolve constraints. Having a balance is really, really critical. We've seen some companies really try to optimize, for example, on speed, but forget about quality or predictability or compliance and security. So it's really important to make sure that however you're measuring it, making sure you're taking a balance for you across a number of different outcomes that you're trying to drive within the organization. The perception gap is real, right? Developers and folks may feel like they're getting faster, but the reality of how those teams are delivering and how the product areas are delivering may or may not reflect that. But constraints are ultimately going to be your unlock. You can't have any sort of individual gains without having constraint elimination, and therefore, at the end of that, not having any real sort of organizational value that's generated. So putting this in action this week when you return to your teams, or next week if you're taking a few days off, first thing I would do is to map my current constraints. Where are the bottlenecks into your SDLC? Sit down with teams, walk through the SDLC, walk through the data that you have in place, and actually go through and identify where those might be. Focus on 3 of them to start, right? And use the 7 categories. Categorize them across each one of the core areas, see where your biggest constraint category is, and focus on those. And then establish some baseline metrics, whether you're using the 4 pillars or something of your own device. Being able to actually set those baseline metrics from today will allow you to then start to measure what's changing, what's not changing over time. In the next 30 days, I would definitely look at then how do we drive this systematically within our organization. So putting together constraints dashboard, or putting something together which the teams are continuously reviewing, management continuously reviewing, and you're able to share with external stakeholders is really important. Setting up a balanced scorecard across the 4 pillars or across your categories to be able to communicate that more broadly, and then prioritizing the constraint elimination work. Making sure that the teams aren't just over-optimizing on the pressures of delivering a roadmap, but also finding ways to balance those between constraint elimination and whatever their top task priority is. So that's it for me. I appreciate it. If you do want a little bit more information in depth, some bit more research on the RACER framework, you can download it from there. Otherwise, we will be downstairs. Love to chat with any folks about your experience, what you're seeing, what resonates with you, what doesn't resonate with you. And yeah, any questions? What are you finding is most commonly identified primary? Okay, it depends a little bit. I think in clusters of our clients, it's very much governance and security and compliance related is probably one of the biggest constraints that we see in those areas. Cultural constraints are massive as well. When it comes to code base, pull requests in of themselves are probably not one that we hear directly, but certainly there's certain LLMs that are far more effective in certain code bases and certain languages than others. And that's one that constantly pops up. And there are also architectural constraints, whether sort of monorepo is one, for instance, where certain LLMs really struggle in that context to be able to work very effectively. How do you get engineers to trust the metrics over their own experience, especially in their sense of productivity, is a big part of morale and buy-in. I wouldn't prioritize metrics over their own experience. I think that the key bit is actually to combine both of them. Qualitative feedback, human feedback is really important. It's not always trustworthy, but having that feedback loop in addition to just pure hard data is really, really important. And combining those two together to drive the conversation, I think, is equally important. So I wouldn't prioritize one or the other. That would definitely not be my approach. How would you translate this to early stage companies, new teams, particularly with respect to measuring baseline as these teams start off on all the tools? I mean, just start measuring the baseline, right? Early stage companies and new teams have the benefit of not having a tremendous amount of baggage that can ultimately hold some larger organizations back. So what I would focus on essentially is, whether it's a 4 pillars or a subset of it, agree what the things are that you want to measure, what are the outcomes you're trying to drive within those sort of contexts that are really important to moving those teams forward. Focus on those, baseline those metrics, and go from there. How have the most advanced companies solved the constraints? It's really nothing more than just obsessing over them. Putting it systemically within their organizations, not just treating it as a sort of one-off thing that you do every quarter, but sitting down, having a really, really thorough conversation around the SDLC today, including both quant and qual feedback, what's holding us back, how do we translate that to action, opening up constraints in a backlog, and managing those like you would any other backlog, and holding yourself accountable for managing them. The clients that we see doing that very effectively are the ones that are making significant gains on the transformational element of how they organize teams and how they deliver. Do you see burnout as a problem with people context switching and working on several tasks in parallel? Yes, but I see that as probably something that's always been the case. Certainly in my 20 years of working in software engineering, I think context switching and burnout as a result of that has always been a massive issue. I think when you think about the agentic mode and the orchestration of agents, I think this actually has the opportunity to solve that problem in very unique ways for certain engineering teams, in a way that I can actually work through and control a series of orchestrated agents to work through a backlog of either technical data or whatever. And it gives the engineer, I think, a bit more autonomy around that. How can this framework work with outsource or hybrid dev teams? I don't think it... I think if you treat outsource or hybrid dev teams not as outsource or hybrid dev teams, I think that is the answer. If you treat those teams as something different, then it doesn't make a lot of sense. I would recommend that with those teams, you treat them as internal teams or as you would your internal teams, and focus on exactly what are the outcomes we're trying to drive, how are we going to measure that, and then how are we going to measure the journey along AI. I wouldn't even think about them as two different teams. I don't think that's helpful necessarily. I think the one advantage you do have with outsourced teams is a bit more of a commercial backing between being able to drive expectations, depending on the contractual structure, obviously. That's a lot of metrics. How do you avoid creating negative behaviors, incentivizing people to game the metrics? So part of the reason there are a number of metrics is they're counterbalancing metrics to make sure that you're not optimizing one at the consequence of the other. We do always recommend with our customers that that is a lot potentially to start with. So when it comes down to how you're engaging with teams and what you're managing, maybe take a subset of those to start, to focus on the particular areas that you want to drive, the priorities that you have within the organization, and then look at growing from there and scaling from there. But our customers that do use it always look across it, because those metrics are all designed to counteract and relate to one another. And so having just a subset does limit your view on, if we optimize in this area, it has a negative impact on this area, or if somebody's gamifying this, we'll be able to spot it here. You mentioned mapping SDLC, but metrics are focused on value realization. Do elite orgs look at PDLC in your experience? They do and they don't. And it depends a lot on how that PDLC is managed and captured. So the organizations that we work with that actually have mapped out the entire PDLC to SDLC within a single or dual system, but one that relates all the way through, that they get that visibility, yes, they absolutely do that. The ones where you have a complete break, and the PDLC might exist in Confluence or Notion in unstructured data in a way that doesn't allow you to measure it, they struggle because the huge amount of time that they spend at that stage of the delivery process, they can't actually measure in meaningful ways, and so it becomes a little bit more difficult to understand how do we optimize the PDLC. That's me.